Hey everyone, welcome to the Voice San Diego Potcast. I'm Jesse Marks, Associate Editor here, and I'm joined by Kinsee Morlan, who covers arts and culture.
Hello, Jesse.
Happy 420. Or actually, 423 is the date when we're recording this. But in any case, it was a busy couple of days in San Diego for the marijuana industry. There were a few concerts and parties and standoffs in Balboa Park, which I will tell you about in a second. I actually attended the Cannabis Village at the Earth Day event on Sunday, April 22nd, Kinsee. And it was quite large. There were vendors representing the various dispensaries and manufacturers, plus the various trade groups. Dolores Huerta was there. She's the famous labor activist who worked with Cesar Chavez. Genevieve Jones-Wright, Dave Myers, both are running for the top law enforcement positions, and they both believe that the county's prohibition on cannabis is counterproductive, which is pretty big for a politician to say, right?
Yeah, it is. I think what you forgot to mention about this whole event, though, is all the music. There was a lot of a weed-friendly enclave of musicians that performed there that day. It was pretty cool.
What do you know? Quite a few Rastafarians.
Yes, surprise.
So there was also a really bizarre moment when a group of Christian warriors, I guess is safe to call them, they began marching through the festival with megaphones and spouting off all sorts of bad stuff about the evils of marijuana. One guy was wearing a hat that said "Repent, perverts," and it was clearly just sort of a trolling expedition through the middle of this very peaceful calm event. And what you're about to hear is an audio clip that actually I recorded, and it's an argument that ensued between one of those activists and some random guy who was working one of the booths. He started shouting back, and he actually handed one of the activists a joint, and the activist tore it up, and so they went back and forth for a few seconds.
Oh my goodness.
You don't know the Jesus Christ in the Bible. Oh, you don't know Jesus Christ. Your salvation is that green leaf. Your salvation is that green leaf. Let me have that. Let me have it.
There it is. There it is. That is God in your hands, sir. He said it is for your benefit.
Give me some more.
He states it in
Give me
his
some
Bible
more.
clearly.
Give me some more of that.
Oh, no, I will not let you
Give me
waste
some more of
God's
that.
plan anymore, sir. The herbs of the earth are for the benefit of man.
And I should also note that I've actually seen those guys before. I for the old newspaper I used to work for in Palm Springs, I covered the Trump rally in Anaheim, and those guys showed up. So yeah, again, they just live for this sort of thing, and at some point the festival goers just kind of realized that if you ignore them, you will rob them of their power, and they went away.
So I was at Earth Fair too, and my experience was a little bit different, probably because I got there right when things opened up. Young kids, that's how I roll. So I missed that drama. And to me, it was just fascinating because I was walking through and doing that journalist thing where I'm eavesdropping on everyone. Yeah. And there was a mom with her young daughter explaining oh, you should really call it cannabis and not weed because it's more respectful. And so there was this, and she couldn't have been more than 13 or 14. And so that was a really interesting conversation to overhear. And then there was an elderly couple who were very interested in the medical uses and all the medical booths and sort of gravitating toward the, all the elixirs and sort of the wellness stuff. So that was fascinating. I think there's a lot of people out there, and we'll get to this in the second half, who are so curious and have so many questions about medical. So a lot of those booths with the wellness products were just crowded all morning while I was there. So that was just fascinating to me. I guess I expected Cannabis Village to be, San Diego is one of the only cities with, it's notorious for having really strict regulations when it comes to beer festivals. So in other cities, you can take your kids to beer festivals, right? Because, they're children and no one's going to accidentally serve a 5-year-old beer. And so really there's these a craft beer festival can be this really fun family-friendly event. In San Diego, they literally have to put up fences around it.
Yeah, I noticed that. Not in this case, though.
Yeah, so this was way different than I expected. I just went expecting that Cannabis Village would be either fenced off or way in another area of the park, but it was right smack dab in the middle. And everyone had to walk through, you had to walk through Cannabis Village to get from one side of the Earth Fair to the other. That was fascinating to me.
They did block off the cannabis, which is literally the bus that takes tourists from the beach to the Urban Leaf, for a good reason.
Oh, okay. What was that good reason?
Well, because people were just hotboxing it.
Okay. All right. So there was a little fence around the stage. I did see that. So good old puritanical San Diego was still there in some senses. So I took some time and just wanted to get to know some of the more interesting, in my mind, vendors there. I gravitated toward one woman in particular. Her name is Chris Morwood. She's from Colorado. And she was there talking about her Cali cannabis books. These are children's books. One is about cannabis and the other one focuses on hemp.
And it's just basically 101, where do you keep it safe, from your children, the difference between prescription drugs and cannabis, and cannabis therapeutics, what states are legal. And then we just came out with this one this year in January. And this is about hemp, so it's all the different uses of hemp, where it originated, what it was used for, and the different laws. And then that way we're just trying to kind of boil it down to basic 101, where people understand that it is just a plant and that it can, be utilized.
So those are some pretty nifty little books. I also talked to two guys. They're with a company based in San Diego called Granny Smith Sports. And they were there. They're a hemp skateboard company. And here's what they had to say about their products. Okay, so I'm looking at a skateboard. It looks like a normal plastic skateboard, but
It does, but this is the plant-based alternative to a plastic skateboard.
Okay.
More durable than your plastic counterpart.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, and more environmentally friendly, or what are
Exactly.
Tell me about all the selling points of a hemp.
It is more sustainable than wood, replenishes, regrows faster than oak, anything like that. There is no landfill material, anything like that involved with the skateboard. And then the resin we use is all plant-based tree sap resin as well. So the entire product is 100% plant-based.
And last but not least, I talked to a guy. He looked a little lonely, wasn't getting much action in his booth, but his name is Dennis Markowski. He is from the Temecula Growers Association. And he told me he thinks Temecula, which of course is known for its wine. Have you been up there yet?
I have. It's beautiful.
Okay. He thinks that the whole region will eventually be known for its cannabis growth as well.
I think the two agricultures are going to go together. Wine and cannabis will be infused on the wine side and on the cannabis side.
Okay.
We will take the terpenes from the wine and infuse it into cannabis oils, and you will have Chardonnay flavors, whatever flavor of wine, you can have that flavor tasting in your cannabis oils.
Very cool.
And, Kinsey, in lieu of our occasional news segment with Vito Di Stefano, we sent him to Baked, which was San Diego's first ever festival celebrating legal weed in California. I think it was actually put on by Urban Leaf. It happened on the night of 420, of course. And he took some photos for us, which we'll include with the podcast post on voiceofsandiego.org. And he also talked to some of the festival attendees about why he was there. So here is 31-year-old Natasha Anderson, who thinks cannabis will be as big as craft beer pretty soon.
I think San Diego's cannabis culture is pretty much growing in the same path that the brewery culture has grown, where you're seeing a lot of these entities pop up in, before it used to be underground scene, now you're coming to festivals in the harbor, you know what I mean? So I think San Diego as a city is seeing it as a tourist opportunity, which is great. At the same time, I'm curious to see what that will look like for some of our southern neighbors, so your Chula Vistas, your national cities, to see if they'll also have the same opportunity to see that growth as well.
And here's Olga Peshkin. She is a 26-year-old New York transplant who's been living in San Diego for the last 8 years. She was there to tell people about her cannabis cooking oil that she makes.
I am here to meet like-minded people. I am here to share a beautiful product that we have brought to market so that everyone else can benefit from the beautiful... What is your
product, real quick?
The product is Elevated Cooking Oil, and it is infused cooking oil. We have a THC and a CBD line, and we offer it in 4 flavors: regular, garlic, lemon, and habanero.
Wow, sounds delicious.
Would you try that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the flavor profile of cannabis or THC would mess with my, I really like a good cooking oil.
Well, that's true. But I do like to experiment. So I will do that, and I'll let you know how it goes.
All right.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone, because when we come back, we're going to have a good conversation about what we know and don't know about the medicinal value of cannabis. Stay tuned. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Voice of San Diego podcast. Kinsee, our conversations generally tend to focus more on public policy and regulations and occasionally on more sort of the cultural aspects of cannabis, weed weddings, THC-infused beer, all those sorts of fun things. But it seems to me, and probably to most people, that the medical benefits of cannabis remain a mystery, and the biggest stumbling block to this is the federal government, which continues to classify cannabis as a class 1 narcotic on par with heroin. So in this next conversation, I wanted to highlight some of what we know and what we don't know about cannabis. And for help, we're joined by Michelle Sexton, a naturopathic doctor and assistant adjunct professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of California, San Diego, where she helps with medical cannabis research. She also consults privately with patients. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by Jamie Corroon, who has a private practice as well. He is the founder and medical director of the Center for Medical Cannabis Education in Solana Beach. And he, too, holds a naturopathic doctorate and a Master's of Health degree from San Diego State. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you.
So I heard both of you guys talk a couple of weeks ago at an event that was sponsored by some delivery services folks, and it was really, really interesting conversation. And I think specifically your talk about what some of the literature shows and doesn't show was a breath of fresh air, because there are so many hyperbolic claims that I hear being made in the cannabis community. And so you guys sort of came in and said, well, to be fair, here's what we know and here's what we don't know, and based on our own research and our experience, and that was awesome. But before we delve into some of the details, can you give us a sense of your professional experience and what sort of clinical as well as anecdotal experience might be relevant to this conversation? We'll start with you, Michelle.
That's a very big question.
He wants your creds. Lay them all out.
Let's lay a foundation.
Well, I started in this field studying the pharmacology. So I ended up working in a lab at the University of Washington. So we were doing a lot of laboratory experiments and trying to understand, the molecular signaling related to the endocannabinoid system. And we were particularly interested in its role, the role of the endocannabinoid system in inflammation. THC gets all the attention pretty much, and that drastic side effect of euphoria, and how can we avoid that? And we know a lot less about that, but it's really relevant for patients because there's hardly any chronic disease process that doesn't involve inflammation. And it turns out, all the systems in our body are talking to each other all the time. So, we may be just treating inflammation using cannabis. Who knows? And that's what we were studying. And I had this head knowledge about it, and at the same time, medical marijuana was really increasing in Washington, and my curiosity was very clinical because I was getting and then got my doctorate degree. So it became an extension of my practice to, patients started reaching out because they were looking for, something more than what I've come to call the herban legends.
Oh, yeah.
That's good.
We'll get into those.
Jamie.
How about you?
Well, I guess I'll just pick up where Michelle left off. I mean, what I first started to observe was an increasing interest in medical cannabis among patients and a need for information and education because they were exposed to this story about cannabis being a drug of abuse and this illicit substance that had deleterious effects on our society for decades. And then all of a sudden, they're hearing Sanjay Gupta talk about it on CNN, and there's some major news organizations like NPR and USA Today that are talking about cannabis in a totally different way as a therapy for a very broad range of medical conditions. And so these people were curious and confused, and they wanted to talk to somebody about it, preferably their doctor, but their doctor didn't really know about it. And so there was clearly a need for educated healthcare providers with a specialty in this area. And I also am very curious as to the delta between what is real and what is hype in anything, but especially as it relates to complementary and alternative medicine and specifically medical cannabis. So I wanted to get involved from a research perspective as well and understand really what was going on and what was being substantiated through reliable scientific methodologies.
So I wasn't at that event. Can we go back to how you set it up? You guys stepped up and sort of walked back because I do hear things all the time that cannabis CBD can cure everything under the sun, including, maybe even cancer and all these really big issues. So what happened? What impressed you there? You were saying they impressed you. So.
Well, I think what impressed me was actually the fact that you guys took a step back and you said, well, we hear all these claims about like CBD specifically, and there may be some disagreement between the two of you, which we should probably get into, but CBD is not actually a pain reliever, is it? Like that had just sort of struck me as being kind of amazing because everybody's told me that it was. Can you help us break down that specific claim about CBD where?
I'll just
I see you guys getting a little uncomfortable over there.
I'll start by asking a question.
Okay.
If someone tells you that CBD relieves their pain, and yet you're looking at a clinical trial, if there was one and there isn't, showing that CBD did not relieve pain, what would you conclude about whether CBD was relieving pain or not?
Placebo effect? I don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
I'll just say that many people are reporting that CBD is helping to reduce their pain.
Okay.
And I don't know if we have enough really well-designed randomized controlled trials, in fact we have none, to really substantiate that. But if the pain is due to inflammation, and we know from a variety of different methodologies that CBD is a potent anti-inflammatory, then perhaps it is the mechanism by which that it's providing pain relief there.
Or it also binds to a serotonin receptor, and so by reducing anxiety, people may have less pain. But yeah, we don't. It's never been studied as an analgesic. That was never a property that was discovered about CBD from early on. So, and I think you were right about. I like the idea of the placebo. Because, if you meet someone and they are this strong testimony to what it did for them, you already come to the use with a belief system about it. And we know that can really affect health outcomes.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, I once sprained my ankle and smoked some weed and magically couldn't even focus on the pain on my ankle. So the anecdotes they're all over, right? They're there.
Well, I don't want to suggest that a person's subjective experience is not important because at the end of the day, we don't care as long as they're experiencing the outcome that they want to experience. But if we want to make claims about what we think this thing does or that thing doesn't do, then we need to have a little bit more scientific scrutiny.
More time, more science. Okay, so Michelle, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing right now at UCSD, some of the work being conducted there. Specifically, we're interested in this concept of the therapeutic window. KPBS had a story the other day that highlighted the work of Dr. Mark Wallace at the Medical Center. And his research suggests that there's a point at which using THC for pain management is actually counterproductive. Tell us more about that.
Well, that came from Dr. Wallace's research where he conducted an inhaled cannabis study for pain. And I think he's still analyzing that data, but he published some of it. And it agreed with a lot of the other literature on inhaled cannabis, which we're talking about THC-containing cannabis. None of the cannabis that you could get from the University of Mississippi was CBD-containing until recently. So we're talking about THC as probably the active ingredient, and that people had significant pain relief at relatively low dose, which we're saying 3 to 5% THC content. And so then if you go look at what's available in the marketplace, you rarely find anything under 15% THC content. So, under careful observational conditions where they then gave them higher percentage, the pain scores were not as good as they were at the lower dose.
Interesting.
How many dispensaries do you think know that? Do they have
0.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I would just make a comment about that. I think to some degree there's almost an assumption that there's a linear dose-response relationship. We're talking about the dose-response relationship, and to some extent I think we all operate under the impression, and this isn't specific to cannabis, that more is better. So a higher dose will lead to greater pain relief. And we're trying to really elucidate what that dose-response curve is for various cannabinoids taken individually and together, also based upon the method of administration, because the method of administration determines many things, including the dose that's actually received. So you could start out by exposing an individual to 10 milligrams of THC, but if they inhale it, they're going to receive a different dose than if they ingest it. And as a result, it may have a different impact on their pain relief.
I remember somebody asking you a question at the event about literally using cannabis as an enema, and you guys basically said, there's no...
Stop doing that.
There's no evidence of that. Stop
was it an enema or a suppository?
Yeah, suppositories.
Put it in with your coffee enema.
But Kinsee, to your point, one of the things that Mark Wallace and others are showing is that we may not have a linear dose-response relationship. There may be what we call like a U-shaped or a bell-shaped curve where a medium dose may actually be more effective than a high dose or a low dose. And we don't know necessarily whether that's the same for an isolate versus a whole plant extract, because there are some studies that show that the dose-response curve is different for an isolate versus a whole plant extract.
Okay.
And that was CBD, right?
Yeah, that particular study
so
was CBD.
the two molecules pharmacologically don't have a lot in common.
Yeah.
And Michelle, you've noted in your research that, in just talking about this issue, that THC wasn't isolated until the 1960s, which that helps explain why cannabis, even though it has a long history, didn't gain the reputation as, being a medicine until relatively recently. So why did it take so long, and what has been the effect of the delay on our public policy discussion? When I was a kid, CBD was not when I was younger and more involved in marijuana, CBD, people weren't really talking about it. So when did this all happen, and how has it affected the public policy discussion?
Well, CBD was actually isolated a long time before THC, back around the early 1940s.
Oh.
But they didn't find anything special about it in the tests they had at that time. It just was uninteresting. Although that, cannabis had been used historically for centuries. And
right.
So there was that historical data on it as a medicine, but we were at that point in science where we wanted to isolate the active ingredient. And so they assumed CBD was not the active ingredient. And then, many years later,
threw it aside.
1964, THC was isolated. And then you could see these strong effects. And it's like, oh, this is it. This is the one,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's the good guy and the bad guy, maybe, too.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you think that delayed our public policy response because it took so long for us to isolate it and really think about it?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it could have, because, if you look at morphine, it was isolated back in the 1860, I think,
mm-hmm.
somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, it became acceptable as a medicine. Around the same time that cannabis was being demonized and falling out of favor by the medical community, concurrently, doctors who, like ourselves, used natural principles and botanicals, all of it was getting squelched and fell out of repute. So, it wasn't necessarily just cannabis. It was the whole, health, pharmaceutical, industrial complex and the chemistry revolution.
So the point of the lecture that I went to was actually opioids, right? And using cannabis potentially as a replacement for opioids. So I read in the Union Tribune a couple weeks ago really some startling facts, and the Surgeon General had actually come out and suggested that people keep within their homes certain
Narcan, or
yes, it's
the anecdote.
Naloxone, I think is how you pronounce it, to prevent an opioid overdose, and just the numbers were staggering. It's like 115 people die every single day from opioid abuse. Where does cannabis fit into that conversation? Can it be used as a replacement to opioid abuse, and how so? What does the literature tell us at this point in time?
Well, the anytime you are trying to understand the evidence base for a particular medical intervention, you have to try to sift through a lot of different methodologies and try to focus on the preponderance of the evidence. Just starting with Michelle and I and our clinical practice, I think both of us are seeing patients who are in chronic pain that are benefiting from using cannabis. As a result, many of these patients are able to take lower doses of their opioids or take less frequent doses. As a result, they're experiencing generally fewer side effects and a higher quality of life. So that's our own clinical observation. Do you concur, Dr. Sexton?
I would concur with that. What we've been formally doing, and this will be my first task at UCSD, is a chart review of about, I think, probably around 300 patients that I've shared with the pain department. So, we want to go get those numbers and do statistical analysis and be able to publish it to show, the medical community at large, have it peer reviewed that this is good data. We need to take a deeper look at this. But where we started was asking the patients. So we started a cannabis use survey through Bastyr University a few years ago and just started asking people. And of course, it could be viewed as bias because the people who responded are responders to the medicine.
Right.
But you can see their overwhelming response in their scores on quality of life, the drugs that they actively withdrew from by using cannabis, and just how they rated the quality of the medicine in general. The only two conditions that kind of came at the borderline of improvement or not were anxiety and tremor and depression. So, and those are still things up in the air about how cannabis interacts with those conditions. But Jamie can speak a bit more about the drug substitution.
Yeah, and also just to continue through the hierarchy. So I started with our clinical observations, which are subject to bias, and then Michelle started talking about surveys of patients that were published in peer-reviewed journals that substantiate our own clinical experience. But even those surveys, those cross-sectional studies, are subject to bias. There have been a number of what we call ecological studies that have gotten a lot of attention in the last 4 years that look at the association between state medical marijuana laws and various opioid-related outcomes. And most of these studies agree with one another. They use different data sets. Some use the Medicaid data set. Some use Medicare Part D. Some use 2010 to 2014. Others use different date ranges. But what they are showing generally is that states that have medical marijuana laws and provide access to medical marijuana dispensaries are generally showing lower prescription drug rates for conditions that cannabis is thought to treat, specifically opioids. They are also seeing lower rates of hospitalizations due to opioid abuse and opioid use disorders, lower admissions to opioid-related treatment programs for addiction, and most importantly, lower opioid overdose mortality rates. And so now we have a third type of research to substantiate this. And then finally, we have clinical trials. There are actually clinical trials in human subjects who have chronic pain and are using opioids and cannabis. And what those clinical trials are showing, and we need more of them, we need larger studies, but they're showing that cannabis does provide some enhanced analgesia beyond what the opioids are providing. And in many cases, they are delaying the development of tolerance, which is this adaptation physiologically where a person needs a higher dose over time in order to maintain the same effect. So that this curve is being pushed out. And also, as I mentioned, that we're seeing on our clinical practice, in clinical trials, they're also seeing patients that can take lower doses or less frequent doses of these opioids.
Is that when you meant what you meant when you said that THC can prime the opioid receptors for opioids? Is that
yeah, potentially. So that night I mentioned that THC has been shown to have some affinity for 2 of the 3 opioid receptors, the kappa and the delta receptor. I think most of the analgesia from morphine derivatives comes from the mu receptor, the mu opioid receptor. So I don't know if we really are clear as to exactly how THC may be providing some sort of potentiation of the opioid analgesia, but at least that has been demonstrated.
Yeah.
So we're in the middle of a huge cultural shift, right? But are you still coming across patients who are more, even though there's so much data about how dangerous and addictive prescription pills can be, are you still seeing patients who are more comfortable taking these pills than cannabis? Is that still a thing?
I think there is a lot of stigma, residual stigma, even though there's a lot of education and media attention. And people are very afraid to even experience it or try it. Mm-hmm. And so, it's taking their primary care doctor or whoever's prescribing their opiates through the pain department to step up and say, we can't keep you on these medications. And so this is our next step for you. Okay. They may have tried all the other drugs. And so then the patient realizes they're at the end of a road.
Right.
And this is the next thing.
So you already mentioned combining cannabis and opioids. What's the biggest benefit of that? Just to be clear. So the biggest benefit might be that A, their tolerance doesn't go up, and B, that they could wean off of it easier?
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, they're going to get additional pain relief. Second, they may delay the tolerance, the development of tolerance to the opioids. Third is if they are able to take a lower dose or less frequent dose, they're experiencing fewer side effects, and maybe they can discontinue the opioids entirely.
Okay.
But I will say, all the patients that come in to see me, they want 100% symptom control. They want to get off all of their prescription medications, and they don't want to be impaired at all.
Yeah. You're seeing a certain type of patient,
Yeah.
aren't you? Somebody who's fed up.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about the effects of THC and CBD when they're combined. This was also an interesting part of the talk. I remember, I think you had suggested, correct me if I'm wrong, but CBD can actually help take some of the edge off of THC. Is that true?
Well, it's it's observational for one. There are some different types of studies that support this. One is called functional brain imaging, showing, two different parts of the brain or parts of the brain lighting up differently when exposed to each compound separately and then together. So we know that there is modulation going on. There's a lot of speculation about how this is actually occurring biochemically or at the molecular level. But one thing that has been measured, a lot of these things haven't been repeated multiple times. And,
right.
The molecular techniques are not perfect, but that cannabinoid 1 receptor binding THC, is really responsible for all of these effects that some people want to desperately avoid. And so CBD has been shown to bind the CB1 receptor, but not in an activating way, in a way that modulates it and turns it down when THC activates it.
Interesting. Is that why, when people talk about the bad experiences when they, freak out, it's oftentimes from edibles, and those edibles are always infused just with THC? Is that, is it?
Well, yeah, they got too much THC, and often it doesn't matter how much CBD is there at that point. THC is really potent and is going to override, because if it's like a 1-to-1 ratio and people get 10 milligrams of THC, and that can be a lot for a lot of people, and there's 10 milligrams of CBD there. There's other studies suggesting that even with higher and higher doses of CBD, it's not going to take that away. It's not really an antidote.
Oh, so you can't just go and be like, oh my God, I'm freaking out. Where's my CBD oil? Ah! So no, that's not what you're saying.
Well, maybe.
Okay.
Now,
right, this is good to know, because one of the biggest questions I get is newbies who are afraid. And so they don't want this thing to happen with the THC freak out, and for whatever reason, smoking, they don't want to smoke. So edibles seems like the most, I'm just eating a piece of candy. So that's really interesting that this might be
I only say maybe because, first of all, anything is possible. We talked before about what CBD can do. And we talked about people having a perceived effect of pain relief without a lot of good substantial research demonstrating that. But the onset of action is key. If you're having a borderline panic attack because you've ingested too much THC, to ingest CBD is obviously not going to help because that's going to take a while. So maybe if you had a CBD vape cartridge or some high CBD flower and you started to use that, perhaps it would attenuate some of those effects.
But there's other antidotes that have been discussed. So
little Almond Brothers, some orange juice. No.
Yes, citrus.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
there's something to that.
The compound limonene may be responsible for that. But so at the Hemp Fest up in Seattle, I mean, you used to see people just like passed out all over the place from, dabs.
Too much. Yeah.
And really, you could just take them almost any cold soda and it would perk them up. So
Really?
Caffeine, drinking a soda, lemonade.
I've heard black pepper, inhaling black pepper. Is that?
Oh my goodness.
No science?
That's a joke that somebody committed on you, it sounds like.
Well, it's I don't know what the mechanism would be, but maybe snorting black pepper would
I just
distract you.
Inhaling the fumes, not snort. I would never do that. I would never suggest that. But the scent, sorry.
Well, there's a compound there in black pepper that binds the cannabinoid 2 receptor, but at this point, we don't know that binding that receptor is going to affect an overdose of THC.
Well, speaking of which, can we talk more about these herban legends that you mentioned? I think one of them
it's a
you
good
gave.
term. Did you come up with that?
Maybe.
One of them you gave, right, at the event, and it was that people claim that CBD actually turns into THC in the body, which is not true. Can you give us any other good examples that you hear often?
I mean, the herban legend that I've been harping on for a while now is the indica sativa one. Oh yeah, that's
not true.
It really scares you, doesn't
You're crushing my reality here.
I know.
My mind is blown.
Yeah. So, I mean, it may exist. Maybe it's a legend and it's something that everybody believes in, and therefore it happens or works. But if again, we're trained as scientists, so I go read the literature. And there's been multiple people that have published pretty large data sets of, a lot of chemotypes and shown that they don't really separate out because most of them are high THC. And so, our speculation from an ethnobotanical level is that this hybridization for high THC content resulted in the loss of biodiversity. We lost CBD. And also, if you look at the terpenoid profiles, they're very similar there too. And there's only a few standouts. And so if something we're going to, tune it to make it, if it's the same THC content, but you're saying this is different from this, what is it? And the terpenoids are the most likely thing. Huh. But if we've lost that terpenoid profile now, what is really a sativa? And what was it originally? We may never know because they're so hybridized. We don't know what those land races originally were most of the time.
These two camps are freaking out right now by hearing this. I mean, there's like people that are so into either one or the other.
Yeah.
Well, I think typically it's been established based upon the phenotype or the physical appearance of the plant. And if the plant was tall and skinny with wide nodes and long, thin leaves, it was considered a sativa. And if it was short and fat with short nodes and fat leaves, that it was considered an indica. But what Michelle is saying is that there doesn't really appear to be any chemical composition that is consistent across indicas or sativas, and that you just get a wide variety, and it's not really characteristic when you look at all of the compounds in the flower.
So but it can't all just be marketing, right? Because some people will say, indica feels more like a body high for me, whereas sativa will give me sort of more of a head high. Is that just a concoction of people's imaginations is that what the evidence suggests?
I don't think it's a concoction. I mean, I think there is validity to it, and there probably still are chemotypes that are very myrcene dominant, limonene, that are more, give a heavy body feeling to them. Than they're more sedative, and the sativas should have something there that's going to be more stimulant, and where you don't want to just lay on the couch. And so they're out there, but until I think in next January, all product here in California will have to be terpene tested. And like in Washington, people will not be able to walk in and select what they want with their noses. That's what I started out telling patients: follow your nose, go with what smells good.
Yeah.
But once you can't smell it anymore, and you just have to look at it through a window in a package, it's we have to almost start at the beginning.
Somebody asked a really fascinating question at that lecture as well, which was whether or not someday we'd be able to map our individual endocannabinoid systems and create a personalized kind of prescription plan. And I totally forget what your answer was. Can you
I.
Yeah. Can you tell us if that's possible?
Well, I think one of the things that I said was that the system is so highly conserved, going back to original organisms that had what we called a notochord, which was the early form of a central nervous system. It's a highly conserved, the proteins are highly conserved, meaning that there's not a lot of mutations in them. They're important for functions across every system. And so it's conserved, and our body has kept them stable. That's not to say that there aren't some single nucleotide polymorphisms, and we'll learn more about that moving forward. But the function of the system itself, we know, for instance, in mice, if you knock out that CB1 receptor altogether, the baby mice don't thrive and will die of starvation because they can't suck.
Huh.
Yeah, so it's involved with this basic, survival and eating instinct.
Wow.
And then there's all the enzymes involved that produce our endocannabinoids and break them down. And that's often where you'll see more, single nucleotide polymorphisms and malfunction. But we just don't know what it all means yet because they're all difficult to measure at this point.
And everybody's is unique, right?
Probably. I mean, we're all unique across all of our genetics, so probably no different with this system.
Okay.
Mine is super special. So, before we move on from fact or fiction or legend or myth type stuff, so CBD, most common treatment is seizures in children. Is there lots of science back treating kids who have seizures? Is there science backing this one up?
Well, I don't know if I would say that's the most common. I'd say that's probably
in my world as a mom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that is obviously the most common in pediatric patients with seizure disorders, but
in media for sure, right?
Yeah, it's very popular in media, and even yesterday, an FDA advisory panel, which is currently reviewing the NDA, the new drug application for Epidiolex, which is GW Pharmaceuticals' anticonvulsant drug, basically, that is CBD extracted from marijuana. They, I can't remember exactly what the breakdown was, but they overwhelmingly reviewed the research and the application and made a recommendation to the FDA to approve the drug, and that's expected to happen in the next few months. And so I think this is one area where we have some pretty good clinical trial data, at least on Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which are these two intractable seizure disorders in pediatric patients. And so there's a lot of optimism about that and a lot of speculation that that CBD can be used in other seizure disorders. That particular drug is an isolate, and again, we go back to this notion that isolates may have different effects than whole plant compounds or whole plant extracts. But that is clearly an area of interest, and I think Michelle and I both see a lot of patients that have seizure disorders and are interested in whether CBD is something that can help them.
Last one, sleeping disorders. I hear more and more people using CBD to help them sleep. Is there studies around this area, or have you have anecdote, clinically, have you come across this?
Well, so for a long time, sleep has probably been central, to what people treat with cannabis, from my experience, older people. And there's not a ton of study around it. A long time ago, there was a study showing that THC caused a release of melatonin. And so that's our natural brain hormone that regulates our nightly rhythm. That has never been replicated. More recently, there was a study looking at sleep apnea and the potential to affect apneic episodes at night, because this is a big disruptor of sleep for a large population of people. The second study they did where they actually measured the apneic index and they used an EEG, suggests that THC was helping people stay in phase 3 and 4 sleep for longer periods of time. And so that's considered restorative sleep. And for people who are waking frequently, they seem to get back to sleep more easily. And so this is what patients report back. And because often they're experiencing pain at night, they may have a disease process or a traumatic brain injury that prevents them from sleeping or sleeping well. And I would say it's probably one of the number one symptoms, but there's not a lot of research around it. Mm-hmm. And, we were talking about the epilepsy. There's not a ton of research on that. So I think it was what was happening in the popular culture and the fact that GW was there in the right place at the right time to step up with something that could get through the FDA process that made that all happen. Because we have a lot more data on pain, honestly.
So UCSD recently brought you on. We mentioned earlier Mark Wallace, and San Diego State is hosting a forum with him. So is there a rush to research? Are we going to get more research in this area? Is this happening? Are we in the middle of it?
It's definitely happening. I mean, just with all the shifts, around legalization in so many states and the conversations going on at the federal level, researchers who 10 years ago wouldn't have considered looking into this now want to be in the middle of it. So, the biggest problem is funding. It's very difficult to get any federal funding for almost any kind of research, especially in our current administration, who's whacking away at funding. But funding has gone down for scientific research consistently over time. So the funding rate is often less than 10%. So that means, of 100 people that submit an application, less than 10 are going to get funded. So while there's lots of great ideas, the money to do it, and then the second problem, as Dr. Wallace mentioned in the interview with NPR the other day, is the product, that we can only use, and the University of California system is also subject to this, that if they want to do any kind of medical trial, it has to be with product from the University of Mississippi. And then as Dr. Wallace stated, we know it doesn't match the real world, and one area we know it's really deficient is the terpenoids.
And that's because the federal government has a connection to the University of Mississippi? Is that the rationale?
The federal government?
The federal government does, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, they've contracted with them to monopolize the research product that's available for federally funded research. But even if you have funding outside of that and you wanted to do research without federal funding, you would never get it through the FDA process, because if it didn't come from the University of Mississippi, the FDA will not entertain looking at the product.
Huh. So where do you think all this research is headed? We're home to a lot of biotechs. It's got to be pretty valuable locally, actually, I imagine. What's the end game here with all this research? What do you envision the next couple of years look like for pharmaceutical companies?
Well, hopefully a lot of clinical trials will be conducted in human beings with a lot of the conditions and symptoms that we've been talking about, so that we can get a much clearer sense for what the effects of these cannabinoids are. I'm sure that pharmaceutical companies are going to continue to try to modify them so that they have different effects in the body, and so that they can be patented and maybe have novel effects and novel outcomes. And I think San Diego obviously is going to be a place where a lot of that activity is happening.
Okay, I'm not going to make you guys answer these questions because there's a lot of them, but we did a very informal survey on my Facebook page about what are your burning questions when it comes to medical marijuana. The things that came up the most were safety for pregnant moms, which strain is better for treating anxiety, which we already touched on, how marijuana interacts with other meds and with alcohol, the best way for beginners who've never used pot to venture into the medical marijuana world. So where can these people go? What's the best resource for this? Is there one website or one place they can go? What should they be looking for in terms of credibility of when they go to Google these?
They should come to Michelle or myself.
You host a podcast. What's your podcast?
That was the perfect setup.
What's your podcast name?
I couldn't resist. The podcast is called The Cannabis Consult. But
Okay. Do you talk about some of those issues?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. But there's not one single source. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. There's a huge need for more informed and educated medical providers, both licensed and even unlicensed. There's a role for everybody, but with individuals who are really not sure where to start, I think the best approach is to try to find a healthcare provider that has some experience doing this. I think, there are some very well-intentioned and well-informed bud tenders or dispensary employees and people in the medical marijuana space that do not necessarily have any experience managing patients or have any formal education or training. And they can provide a lot of very good information, but to some extent, they don't know what they don't know. They're not sure about things like prescription drug interactions and maybe the importance of a history of psychiatric disorders. And so, even though cannabis has a very favorable safety profile, we've been using it safely for thousands of years. When it comes to using it in the presence of other prescription drugs and complex medical conditions, I think these people are going to be best served by talking to a professional.
So like WebMD, like websites that, people tend to go to for medical information. Do most of them include medical information about marijuana yet? Or is it still they're slow to sort of venture into that area?
I think you'll find some of it, select stuff that they vote on and approve. So I would say education is somewhat censored, for physicians. Our type of practical experience that has come from working with patients, using product at hand, it's a different paradigm. And, just to make a plug for naturopathic medicine, and Jamie and I are naturopathic doctors. There is a difference between a naturopath and a naturopathic doctor. So we're licensed healthcare providers, and our training, we don't look at it in a vacuum. I mean, we like to incorporate any treatment into the complex person and looking at all of their biological systems. And I think this is what a lot of people are missing in their conventional care. It's very fragmented. They see the cardiologist, they see the urologist, they see the oncologist, they see the orthopedist, they see the pain doctor, and often they're not even communicating with each other. So I think one thing they appreciate when they sit down with us is that we take it all in, and we take that in consideration when recommending how they might use cannabis, because it is very individual.
And bud tenders on the, you go into a dispensary, there's the rec side and the med side, and the bud tenders on the med side are not more trained than the rec side, are they? Like, don't wait until you get to the counter and rely on your bud tender to give you medical advice, right? Because I think a lot of people are doing that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of formal training, and that will probably come. That was the same way in Washington State when it was rolled together. But then they did, if you wanted to get a medical license, you had to have your bud tenders or employees take a formal training, and those are the only people that can interact with patients.
Okay, so speaking about rolling the two together, recreational, this is my last question, I promise. You guys have been here for a while, thank you. In terms of public policy, recreational marijuana is legal now, yay, but has that impacted negatively or positively sort of the policies surrounding medical? Like, is there now more focus on recreational and getting the public policies lined up for recreational, or are they both, is it more connected than I'm thinking of it?
Well, my only statement is to say that across the states, my observation, and we studied it formally in Washington State, is that patients are literally being thrown under the bus.
I would say that the two biggest problems that I have encountered since January 1st are, number one, delivery services are no longer able to legally operate, and most of my patients either can't or don't want to go to a dispensary. The experience for them is overwhelming. They feel out of place. It also is confusing. I've had a few situations where the patient went in to get one thing and they were talked into a different product by someone working there. And even though I try to make it very explicit that they should only buy the product that I recommend, sometimes it doesn't actually happen. And but also there's a real inventory shortage. A lot of these dispensaries are having a difficult time keeping the product on the shelf. And so patients that have finally found the product that helps, they go in to get it one day and it's out of stock. And so the huge demand from the recreational side, I think, has caused definitely a few problems. And then also just the new regulations with regard to delivery have created problems.
Yeah, and it sounds like when the testing requirements come into place this summer, it might actually cause even more of a shortage of edibles. There was a panel that the other day that City Beat actually hosted, and somebody said that the standard deviation for THC in edibles is supposed to be, I think, 10%. The state sort of pulled a number out of thin air, but people who know these things better than state regulators say that generally a 30% deviation in THC level is fair. So if you're off by, 15%, they'll throw the entire batch out. And so you might have a situation this summer and when like whole batches of edibles are just being thrown in the garbage. So I think there's going to be even fewer supplies for medical patients than there are at the moment, which is not going to bode well. So I'm sure.
Well, patients were used to, they had their sources, patients that were already existing. And those sources were often local to them. Maybe it was a local storefront. Maybe it was just a local herbalist type of person that was growing it and making product and sharing with them. And that's the system they were used to. And so with all of the local moratoriums, and this is not just San Diego County, but all over the state, they have to get a local license before they can get a state. And in so many areas where these producers are, they cannot get a local license. And so if they continue to function, they're going to be outside of the law. And this is, I think, what's really hitting patients hard is that product that they were used to, and same for me. I mean, I've been working with patients for, 3 years here in the San Diego area, and the products that I was used to having consistently, they may not be around in a couple of months.
I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. Thank you, guys. This is awesome.
Michelle, Sexton, Jamie Corroon, thank you so much for joining us. If you guys have questions out there in Podcastlandia, email my buddy here, Jesse, at jesse@vosd.org. Thanks for listening to Voices San Diego Podcasts. This show is part of the Voices San Diego Podcast Network. Visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcast. There you'll learn more about our award-winning arts and education podcast, CultureCast and Good Schools for All, the Cura Chaos podcast about movers and shakers on both sides of the border, Beer Talk Radio, our business show, I Made It in San Diego, our sports show, The Kept Faith, and the rest of the shows in the network. Voices San Diego is a nonprofit. The majority of our budget comes from grants and donations from readers and listeners like you. If you like the show, please take a minute to go to voicessandiego.org and click the donate button. Or if you have a business and would like to sponsor the show, contact development@voicessandiego.org or call 619-550-5664.